everybody takes part in gender expression and everybody identifies their gender and sexuality in some way. It's not just people in the queer community.
They tried to link queer women to overall women through the shared understanding of gender oppression.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Social Discord, Episode 10. Whose gender is it anyway? Trans history and identity. This is going to be part one of our new series coming out. As usual, I'm your host, Dalen Turk.
I'm Kara Tebow.
And I'm Curtis Medina.
So as I said, this is going to be the first episode of a three-part series that we're going to be doing, and we're going to be diving into trans history and looking a little bit closer at gender expression and gender identity. So with that, let's start out with our usual primers. And so we're going to talk about what is the difference between sexuality and gender identity and gender expression. First off, sexuality is the type of person you're attracted to sexually. For example, and there's a little list here. Gay is same-sex attraction in men. Lesbian is same-sex attraction in women. Bi is attracted to your same sex and the other sex, not always equally. Asexual, which, Curtis, is it Aesexual or is it Asexual? I've never seen that spelling.
You know, that might be the wrong spelling, but it's still pronounced the same way.
Yeah, it might be a typo, might not. Who knows? But asexual, not attracted to any gender. Also says allosexual is those who are attracted sexually to some degree, not completely, though they can experience romantic attraction even without sexual, action in between. And there's
I just checked. It's Aesexual.
Asexual. There we go. Not a typo. Good job, Curtis. And then there's pansexual. That is, you're attracted to people of all genders. This includes people who don't identify with any gender. Many pansexual people describe themselves as being attracted to people based on personality, not necessarily gender or their other sexuality. And then there's this one I actually never heard of before, and it's sapiosexual, and that is to describe those who experience attraction based on intelligence rather than sex or gender. And I'm pretty sure there's a whole web of different sexualities that I've never heard of, and there's actually a link here. It's what's the website? It is Healthline.com, and they have a whole list of different sexualities and how they're described. A to Z, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, what I really enjoyed.
I don't know if I've done a good enough job in past episodes of saying this, but on the website, podcastwithoutborders.com, with underneath each episode, underneath the MP3, the player, there's a link to a PDF and it has all of our show notes and sources. So if you want to take a look at this website, if you can't find it online, go to the show notes for episode 10 and you'll find the link there. It's just right at the top of our notes and you should be able to find it. But with that, could we hear a little bit about some gender identity?
Yeah, and I wanted to say too that it's really important that we do that. We put that online for people because so many shows just kind of like let it fly and just kind of figure it out as they go, and it's really cool that like we're all very like source savvy. Yeah. And so if you don't know what we're talking about, then you can always look it up and get our frame of reference.
Mm-hmm. Curtis types out the whole templates for each show, and so everything that we're talking about you can find in these show notes, and they're very thorough. So take a look if you're interested.
Maybe too thorough.
That's okay.
So next up, we're kind of doing the primers right now just to sort of get into like what we're talking about, because a lot of people out there, even in the queer community, really don't have a great grasp of these concepts. So bear with us for just a second as we go through a few of these. Next up so we already did sexuality. Next up is gender identity. And that is the core of what we're going to be talking about today. Sexuality was kind of the core of what we talked about in the last series, which was Queer as History. But gender identity is a different thing. Basically, your gender identity is what you are, whether or not you were assigned it at birth by a doctor. So we're going to talk a lot today about this idea of how do you know what you are. And a lot of people would say, well, the doctor, they slapped me on the butt and they said, this is a boy, this is a girl. And that was it. But for a lot of people, it's not as simple as that. So gender identity is what you feel you are. And it has a lot more to do with say your hormone levels, how you think, the way that you join with other people, how you congregate, how you feel around other people. And so and it's something that is very complex, and yet in most countries we assign gender based only on your reproductive organs, meaning that they say this child is male, therefore they're a man. This child is female, therefore they're a woman. And it just is not that simple.
Yep. So going right off that is gender expression. So kind of self-explanatory, but it's an umbrella term for how you choose to present yourself to society. So, that can be expressed as a public performance, what we think of as drag queens, a private comfort like cross-dressing, or as self-actualizing round-the-clock representation that expresses your real self, so the trans community. But it's not just about how you dress. Gender association changes how you think, how you speak, your likes, dislikes, some of which fall within the gender stereotypes and some which defy them. Another term that, especially if you're on Twitter, you probably hear thrown a lot is cis male, cisgender. The term cisgender actually just refers to the majority of people in society who feel their assigned gender at birth was correct. So AMAB and AFAB, which stand for assigned male or assigned female at birth, that's usually the acronym that you'll hear as well. So when describing a trans person, we refer to their identified gender, which was previously thought of, as their transition final destination. So for instance, a trans woman was assigned male at birth, but the opposite is also true. And trans people do not feel as if they changed, and I think this is important to remember. They feel like they're correcting something that was always true but misclassified by society. So it's not necessarily, I was born this way and now I went through this butterfly transformation. It was, I was born into the wrong body and now I'm starting to feel like myself.
And also, go ahead.
I was going to say two things. One, so cisgender, really up until we did Queer's History, and now whose gender is it anyway? I always thought cisgender meant straight person, and I don't know why. I get that just like my small circle. That's what I always thought.
No,
and so
I totally did when I heard it too.
Right, and I think that also goes with how the language around sexuality and gender has changed, where forever the two were kind of synonymous, and we'll talk about it more within the episode, where through time and through the movement, gender and sexuality started to branch away from each other. But then another thing too, right above when we were talking gender expression is, Carrie, you mentioned that drag queens, public performance, and although there are the drag shows and it is a performance, there are people who just dress in drag, and it's not necessarily performance.
Yep, it just makes you feel good.
That's just how they express themselves, right?
Yeah.
So although we have RuPaul's drag show, which is a performing drag show, there are people who just dress in drag, and that's just how they express themselves.
But very true. No, that's I don't really totally remember how I initially thought of the word cis. I think it was probably similar to how you were saying, where when you hear like the word straight, it basically just means that it's almost like you're a straight arrow. It's like I think that's where it came from. Like you're the classic, the more of the norm. Nothing too crazy kind of thing. And so, which isn't true, but that is where it comes from. And so so I think when I first heard cisgender, I thought basically the same thing, that it basically just meant you're not queer.
Right.
And one of the things we're doing by separating this into its own series for trans and gender identity is really separating the term queer into different parts to actually make sure that they get equal coverage. So for example, your gender is one aspect of you, but your sexuality is a completely different aspect. And that can, and then they affect each other in different ways. So they're not necessarily just the same thing. So you could be a straight person, but you could identify, your gender differently than what you were assigned, for example. So, I think there's a lot of people that don't necessarily feel like they're part of the queer community when they actually are. Let's move on to to trans, which is going to be one of the main things we're talking about over the next few episodes. It's really cool, actually. A lot of these notes were based on a book called the Trans History, and that's by Susan Stryker. And it's important because this book was actually written by a trans person, and in the next few episodes, we're going to be talking to two trans people and one non-binary person. And what's important about that is so often trans issues are discussed by cisgender people who don't really have a great understanding personally of what they're talking about. So since none of us are trans, it's really important and it's really cool that we're bringing on these people to say it in their own words, not to defend themselves as trans people and or defend their right to exist as trans people, but to be in a safe space to explain who they are.
Yeah, like as someone who literally just said that I didn't know what cisgender meant until recently, I definitely didn't feel comfortable explaining what it means to be a trans person, because I like how I don't know. How am I supposed to know? And so we can talk about the history, we can talk about what's happened, but I'm very excited for the 2 episodes after this because it's going to be very interesting conversations to have.
Absolutely. Yeah. So trans, if you didn't know, and I actually just talked to a queer person living in India who had no idea what the word trans meant. And,
Fascinating.
they had heard LGBTQ, but they had never thought about what the T stands for. Well, spoiler alert, it stands for trans. And it's kind of confusing. A lot of times we'll use the word queer because that's the most acceptable word right now. But it's also because it's kind of confusing because in LGBTQ plus, it sort of implies that it's, that you can be lesbian, you can be gay, you can be bi, or you can be trans, or but actually, like, you can be trans and a lesbian, you can be trans and bi, you can be, so it's, do not think that just because you're one, you cannot be the other. So trans, let me get back to the definitions. I went up way off of our notes. Sorry.
No worries.
The trans is the T in LGBTQ. Many people are confused by this. It is possible, even probable, that a person can be more than one of these letters at the same time. LGB refers directly to sexuality, lesbian, gay, bisexual, while T refers to gender. Thus, a trans woman, which was assigned male at birth, who has always had attraction to women, feels sexual attraction similar to a lesbian. So a trans woman who is sexually attracted to women would in fact be a lesbian. And there is some debate over that, but it's generally accepted that is the truth. The term, we pretty much talked about the acronym and how we've adapted it to that. So yeah, I guess let's move on right into the main part of the show. Basically, let's start off with the absolute most important thing that we're going to say for the rest of the show. And if you don't hear a single other sentence for the rest of the show, like out there, please hear this. There is a difference between your physical sex and your gender identity. What that means is there's 3 parts to your personal sense of self. Your body, which is your physical sex, i.e., you have a penis, you have a vagina, or you have something in between. Your identity is your psychology. It's what you feel you are. Your social gender expression is how you express that gender. And that can be, like we said before, it can be drag. It can be like you just do it as a show, as a presentation, or it could be that you actually, that is how you present your gender 24 hours a day. Yeah, go ahead.
One thing I want to point out too, so we talk about these things, we talk about gender expression and we talk about identity. And I feel like there's this stigma that's built that when you talk about that, you're only talking about, the queer community. but every single person on
No,
earth takes part in gender expression and identity. Like
absolutely.
because it's
Exactly.
talked about more about people who are in the queer community, because it's been more looked down upon through history. It's more of a discussion rather than as like, oh, Tommy's wearing plaid again. Everybody takes part in gender expression, and everybody identifies their gender and sexuality in some way. It's not just people in the queer community.
Some of it is self-expressed gender expression. Some of it is gender expression that gets put onto you. So
Mm-hmm.
when you're young and your parents say go out and play with the other boys, like that is definitely putting a gender expression on you. And it might fit your assigned birth gender, but it might not. And if it doesn't, then you start getting feelings of dysphoria, and you start, like, it doesn't feel like they're talking to you, or it feels like they're talking to somebody else. And so, that we get that a lot. We hear that a lot when we're talking to trans people, is that when they go through these processes of correction of their gender, they reformation, I think is the word, rather than a transformation. They feel like they're showing who they truly are, and they feel like they're being addressed as they truly are. So it's a really healthy thing to try to treat someone in the gender that they identify with.
And a lot of this information right here that we're going through is from genderspectrum.org, and then also coming up here in a second, mypronouns.org. Very interesting websites. If you get a chance, check them out, because they have so much information that explains all this very clearly and concisely. It's very great sources that you found.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I thought they were really amazing too. Some of it I knew, some of it I didn't. Um, you know, I think I knew from pretty early on that it was very respectful to call somebody the correct gender.
Mm-hmm.
But what's more than that, is the psychological aspect of showing someone that you care enough to
Right.
see them as they want to be. And so the quote from Gender Spectrum that I'd love to share is, gender identity is an inherent aspect of a person's makeup. Individuals do not choose their gender, nor can they be made to change it. However, the words someone uses to communicate their gender identity may change over time. Naming one's gender can be complex and an evolving matter. And so, so that's why sometimes it's confusing that, last year they used to go by Bob, but now they go by Gina or something like that. That's why it seems odd to somebody from the outside, but from the inside, from their perspective, it's a constant battle to show who they are, not to become something different. And that's
Mm-hmm.
something that a lot of people get wrong, who don't identify with this. And what you said was absolutely true, that this is something that affects everyone. Every single person goes through this as a child. There's a lot of evidence that you usually cement your gender identity by ages three to four. But some people, especially if they've been told there's something that they've never felt like they are, take a lot longer to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see.
There's a YouTube video that you shared, and they talk specifically about pronouns. And it's a trans person. They're a filmmaker in New York who made this YouTube video. It's talking about, like, trans people and gender, and why you should use these pronouns and the different pronouns. And a good way that they put it that I hadn't really thought of is, as a straight man, like, how would you feel if you go by he him pronouns? How would you feel if someone every day called you, referred to you as she her?
Right.
Obviously you would be offended. You would be like, well, that's not, and they'd be like, well, that's how I see you, so therefore you are she her. But in your mind, well, no, I'm he him. And that's what so many trans people go through their entire lives.
Yeah, and gender is so personal. You're the only one that can name your gender. Otherwise, if people could look at you different ways and they could decide different things about you, and they may not be true. Especially if you're somebody who doesn't adhere as strongly one way or the other as masculine or feminine. These people are constantly, some people are saying he, some people are saying her, some people don't know what to say. And so, it's important to do your best to try to get that right. And so, let's move on to how to interact with a non-gendered person when you're not sure, because that has happened to me. I think it's happened to just about everyone. I mean, you're busy, maybe you don't even look up. Sometimes I'm at work and I don't even look up as I'm taking someone's money and trying to move on to the next person or whatever.
Right.
And so it happens. I've definitely on the phone. I have he, him pronouns, but on the phone, I have definitely been called ma'am and miss like over and over again. It happens like once a week. I mean, it's a lot. I think I have a fairly masculine voice, but who knows? Apparently I don't hear the same thing that, this person, working for AT&T hears. So,
who knows?
So there's a lot of judgment that you make automatically when you judge somebody's gender, and sometimes it's not as clear as others. A lot of people like saying things like sir or ma'am, especially in the South, which is where I am. That's a really common way to say it. You think you're being polite, or and especially at work, and I've done it. I'm guilty of it myself. I say sir all the time. But it may be wrong. So rather than do that, it's either better to either ask somebody's pronouns or not assume what their pronouns are.
Kara, as a woman, because I know there's a lot of women who get even just offended by being called, miss or ma'am. Like, how do you feel about when someone addresses you as like miss or ma'am or, whatever it may be?
I feel like I've had the luxury of feeling like I'm in the right body my whole life. And so it's not something that I maybe think about as often. And I feel I feel like I got lucky. Like we all just got lucky to feel like we were born into the right body. And I feel like Curtis, like you were saying, people in the South, especially, it's a form of respect. It's a well-intentioned, maybe a form of respect, but maybe it's time that we remember a little bit outdated. Because while I might not think twice about it when someone says miss or whatever, that's because I just happen to feel fortunate enough to be born into the right body. So I'm sure that probably matters a lot more to someone who's like, no, I'm not a miss. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Curtis, can you go over some of the different pronouns for us?
Yeah, for sure. So if you're not sure and you want to be safe, most of the time, but not always, it's okay to use they them pronouns. They them is actually something that has been you couldn't. It actually goes back to the 1300s as a way to speak about somebody in the singular. Even though we associate they them with more than one person, it is totally grammatically correct to use it as the singular. And so, for example, we use it all the time without even thinking. If you don't know who you're talking about, you might say, who are they? Let's say somebody called on the phone. Who are they? And then your response might be, I don't know them. What you're saying is, you don't know their gender, therefore you don't want to offend. And that is a really cool thing that everyone does naturally in English. And yet, if the person standing in front of you, a lot of people think it's controversial to not choose he or him, or sorry, he or she, as the only two binary choices. But if you want to be so totally safe and you don't know, and they haven't spoken their gender, they them is usually safe.
So the other day, I'm pretty active on the Facebook, and
Facebook.
And so this actually wasn't my post. It was a post that one of my old friends, Randall Pratt, made, and he's a great guy. And it was a post that he had shared, and it was a series of pictures, explaining basically what we're talking about talking about identity and gender, and talking specifically about pronouns and different ones and how to address people, and just like, hey, if you mess up, just correct yourself, say sorry, and move on. So one person commented on his post, and it irritated me so much, and it irritated him so much, and many others, because he commented and he said, so if a singular person goes by there, are we supposed to say they is or they are? Basically, they tried to take away any justification for the pronoun of they as a singular pronoun for a person because it didn't sound grammatically correct. And so they said, this goes against everything because it doesn't go with American grammar, or English, I guess, yeah, technically American grammar. But basically, they tried to completely make the argument of using they, them as a singular pronoun, like, disingenuous because it didn't sound grammatically correct, so they said it's not justifiable to do it. But then they also went on to argue that the English language has gone downhill because now there's MLA and APA format on how to quote a tweet, and apparently that's just disgusting, and I can't believe how the English language has dipped down this low. And I'm like, okay, you're
who is this person?
But
it's also not grammatically correct to like mislabel someone, so I think they'll get over it eventually.
The first thing I thought of was, English changes, English adapts. I'm sorry that in the 1600s they didn't tell you how to tweet.
I mean, and that's what everybody said, but they were just so bent on getting under everyone's skin and just proving that, well, it doesn't sound correct, so therefore it shouldn't be. And
according to Merriam-Webster, they, them has been used in the singular since at least the 1300s. However, it is a new thing to use it in order to not genderize somebody. So that is a new use of it, but it's sort of using a very old, grammatically correct way of speaking in order to do something modern.
And we were both mistaken in thinking that they, them was the kind of the idea of a neutral pronoun, which it is and it isn't. But come to find out, there's even one that's used more as a neutral pronoun, kind of and kind of not. But it's Z/Z-zer, or it's also Z here, which I had never heard of before.
I have heard it, but I do think this one actually, for some reason, it's troubling more in my speaking. I feel like I'm speaking bad German.
The Heissensweise.
I knew someone in high school that went by Z, and at the time, that was what, 20, not 20, it was like 2008, 2009. Granted, I'm from liberal Portland, Oregon, so it was maybe a little bit more well received. But I remember that was like my first foray into realizing, like, oh, you don't have to be called him or her. And it was really cool, actually. I thought it was, and like, good job, Z, because that took a lot of courage to do that in a private school with a bunch of, rich little white kids.
Yeah, and I mean, and even though I think it's awkward, like, at the same time, I will try my hardest to do it if it's important to someone, So, I mean, it's like, I don't know how high do you hold your your problem with it?
Barrier entry to respecting someone. Like, what is it to me if somebody would prefer to be called something, or if they feel, like they've been misgendered or misidentified, and I can help them feel a little bit more supported? That's like the least human, right?
If you think within the spectrum if you think within a binary spectrum, it goes against what you think. And so I can't imagine there's a lot of people who think strictly binary are willing to be like, oh yeah, Z, or here, like a
lot of times when people say, there's only a man or a woman, they actually mean there's only male or female, which, and they're referring to, they either have a penis or a vagina, which is actually not completely true either. But even if you ignore intersex people completely, which we're going to go into later, you're talking about biological sex. We're talking about gender.
And it goes back to the whole idea that over, the past 100 years or so, the idea or the definitions of gender and sexuality have grown apart, and gender is not sexual and sexuality is not gender related.
Exactly. And the one that actually is, I think, gaining quite a bit of steam, although on YouTube, when the person claimed in this video that it was, there was like 100 people that gave it thumbs down saying that it wasn't. But I actually have heard this quite a bit lately, is LatinX. And I hear it said as LatinX a lot, but I've been told by many people that you're supposed to use it as Latinx, like complex. Well, you don't say complex. you say Latinx instead of Latino or Latina, because that refers to specific genders, and it becomes really hard to non-genderify things in Spanish that genderifies everything.
Well, it's I'm gonna use my crutch. It's very interesting. Because you look at, in America, it's for every noun, it's, the book, the table, the whatever.
Right.
But it's, with German and with Latin languages, and I guess, I don't know what. What is, I guess, is America.
It's gendering.
What is English? I was about to say, what is America's language base? What is English's language base? Is that Latin base? I don't even know.
I think so.
But anyway,
I don't know. I have not studied that aspect of language.
You look at and I had studied German for a while, and you look at these words, and everything is gendered. And so you have like das, der, den in German, which is all the different versions of the, but it depends on the gender of the word. Like, I'm pretty sure Mädchen, which is girl in German, is actually a masculine word. And then I can't remember the German translation, but like necktie in German is, I'm pretty sure, a feminine term, and so everything is gendered.
It's all random, and you have to constantly remind yourself of the 1,000 different things that make zero sense.
So difficult. But with Latinx, it actually started. It kind of picked up
Latinx.
Latinx. It actually picked it. I feel upset because I have Hispanic heritage in me. Like, my grandpa's from Mexico City, and I have not kept up on Spanish at all my entire life, and I feel like I've let my people down. But in this YouTube video, and we've got the link on our notes, it actually started up in the 90s on like some internet forums, and they were trying to, they had the Latino, Latina, and with capital A and capital O at the ends, and they also had Latin, and then with the @ symbol at the end, and they tried that for a while. But a lot of people are basically saying that this, basically changing the language to fit these gender identities is bastardizing the Spanish language or American values, which just seems so closed off to me. Like, I don't know.
To me, it seems like people who are scared of change and who are uncomfortable because, again, they got lucky enough to be born into a body and identity that they feel is correct. And so it sounds to me like a lot of people who are hesitant about something that they just simply don't understand and can't understand, and frankly haven't had to reconcile or grapple with. I think a lot of fear, unfortunately, drives these kinds of conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's discuss what to do if you make a mistake. And I have definitely done this a few times.
It happens.
For example, I guess I'll just say that one of the interviews that we've already done, we record is going to be happening later in the future, but we've already done it. And I started off by saying they, them, thinking it was a safe, neutral word when I already knew that her gender was she, her. And she rightfully corrects me. See what I'm doing already? While they, them is safe if you don't know, or is generally accepted, I think, by most queer people or most safe people. If it's obvious that they are presenting a gender, or in like it was in this case, she told us what her gender was, it is important to use the correct gender pronouns and not just they, them. So if you make a mistake, Um, if if it's clear that that you're wrong, you should say, "I'm sorry," move on, correct yourself, learn it, try to say it right after that. Most of the time, as long as you're trying, most of the time people are going to be totally okay with a mistake here and there. I mean, it's just a cool thing that you're trying it all in most people's eyes. Um, and the other thing that we haven't covered quite yet is non-binary, which is a really cool. Really, I think to me it's actually one of the coolest because it is out almost the exact opposite, I guess, of somebody who only wants to be called he, him, or she, her. Non-binary basically means that you don't want to be known by either. You don't want to be fit into the gender boxes of either one. So in that case, they them would be the perfect terms to get used to, which is something I'm trying to get used to with a couple of really good friends I have that are non-binary.
I feel like non-binary for people who are outside of the trans community is one that's probably the most misunderstood, perhaps. And we talk about it more in these interviews coming up in the next couple episodes. But it's pretty fascinating to hear the actual insight of what it means to be a non-binary person.
Yeah, I mean, it to some degree you don't want to be put in a box. To some degree, you don't want to be called something that you don't feel like you are. And the term binary basically means it's either one or the other. And you say, I beg to differ. And from the beginning, you're constantly trying to find where you fit in, but also not wanting to be called something you don't feel like you are.
Another example of, just because you don't identify as a man or a woman, that doesn't determine who you're attracted to. It doesn't determine who you sexually are attracted to. And it's just another separation of gender and sexuality.
Absolutely. Something that I want to talk a little bit about this very dark subject of conversion therapy. It's something that I actually had on the notes originally for the queer's history aspect of it, but I actually thought it fit really well into this too, because we already said that one quote of, this is not something you decide, this is something you are. So trying to force somebody to basically deny who they feel like they are in order to fit the box of society is sort of the goal of conversion therapy. That's also known as ex-gay. That was used later on because conversion therapy got a bad name for some reason.
I gotta say, ex-gay is just kind of lazy titling. What are we gonna call this process? We're gonna call it ex-gay. Like,
so you don't become ex who you're attracted to.
I think it was meant to be progressive in its own weird way, kind of like what you were saying about the difference between being gay and doing gay.
Yeah.
I think after a while they stopped trying to get people to not be gay at all, but at the very least to say they were gay but to not act on it. And I think that's where ex-gay came from.
We were talking a minute ago about how people were pretty disgruntled over the and I'm gonna butcher this again, the LatinX. Did I do that right? The LatinX?
No, LatinX.
LatinX? LatinX. Yeah. Okay. People get disgruntled, we're disgruntled over LatinX. I'm never going to do this correctly. And, these kind of subtle things where these subtle changes in society. And then you get stuff like this, like conversion therapy, where it's actual forced action to stop people from being who they are because it doesn't fit the norms within society.
So actually, something interesting about conversion therapy. I don't know if you guys heard this. In 2019, the former leader of one of the nation's largest conversion therapy ministries, his name is McCrae Game. He not only came out as gay, but he disavowed the organization completely. And he wrote this very lengthy apology, just begging for forgiveness, apologizing for the damage that it caused, and basically said that conversion therapy is not just a lie, but it's extremely harmful. And that actually happened again recently. I forget his name, but someone else came out, the founder of a conversion therapy group, apologizing. He had 2 gay sons, and he was like, we've done extensive damage. So that is good to see that there's some progress, or that even the people who have founded these groups are disavowing it and realizing that it is abuse.
Well, and so often they were run by people who felt that they had been cured of being gay themselves, and so like right away these people are denying their own sexuality in order to try to convince other people that it's possible too. And so I'm not sure. I didn't read the person you were talking about, but this sounds exactly the same. His name was or is Chambers, and he ran Exodus, and he apologized almost exactly like what you were talking about. Quote, "I'm sorry that there were times I didn't stand up to people publicly on, quote, on my side, who knows some of you so well, and failed to share publicly that the gay and lesbian people I knew were every bit as capable of being amazing parents as straight people that I knew." So, so this ripped apart families, this denied parents or people who wanted to be parents from having kids, this thinking, and all of these former heads of conversion therapy camps and churches, that so many of them came out and basically said it's all crap. It doesn't work for anyone, and that 99.9% is what they said. It does not help. They stay exactly who they are, and it actually destroys their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It doesn't work, but it also led to very high and alarming suicide rates,
mm-hmm.
because you're telling someone, if you can't be this person we want you to be, then you're evil and you're wrong. It was abuse. It really was. It was a wide scale abuse.
A 2018 study found that found that while religiosity
it's a terrible word
against suicidal thoughts and suicidal attempts among heterosexual youth, it was also associated with significantly higher rates of suicidal thoughts and suicidal attempts. 41% of transgender adults in the United States have attempted suicide in their lifetime, compared to only 1.6% of the overall population.
Which is a wild statistic.
Heartbreaking. It's especially heartbreaking when you realize that probably, I don't want to speak for anyone, but I would assume that a lot of that comes from the fact that they're living in a society that's saying that there's something wrong with them. And imagine if we could just support those individuals more and let them and respect who they are, we could hopefully cut down on some of that.
Yeah, and one of the things I really like to bring home with this episode is, if you're out there, you're listening, and you've never questioned your gender, you've never questioned your sexuality, is that it's great to feel empathy for people who are in the queer community who have struggled with this. But at the same time, I think it's even greater to understand that this could just as easily be you. That this could just because you're not part of this community doesn't mean that you could not have been born as a slightly different person and been, pushed in these directions as so many people are. It brings back the question: when you're born, how are you assigned your sex, and should that be how we actually decide? That's your gender. Like, is that fair? Just because it worked for you, is that actually fair to do that?
It's interesting too, because there's like two sides of for people who are kind of within the binary mindset. It seems like there's two sides of justification on that. There's the biblical justification of man and woman, and then there's also and I'll say pseudoscience justification, because science proves that there's more than just the binary outlook, but there's also the pseudoscience outlook where, well, you're biologically either a man or a male or a female, but there's more than that. And so at what point do we let the individuals themselves decide who they truly are?
Okay, but also I really want to understand how people, I guess, reconcile the fact that some people are born intersex, right? We talked about this, I think, a little bit. That means that
1 to 2% of the population,
which means that you're with basically two different parts of
It's either that you have both a penis and a vagina, or that what you have is not clearly recognizable as either.
Right. So if those individuals that so strongly believe that gender is determined by birth, like, do those people, what, they don't exist? What are they? Like, what do you force on them?
They would be, I think historically we see this as they are justified through terms like disfigurement. You know, they were born disfigured.
They're basically the Minority Report. If you guys have ever seen that movie, you know, it's the report that doesn't fit perfectly into your classification, and therefore throws out the entire system, because you cannot have an absolute one way or the other. The other thing I thought was interesting, and I am not great with science, but what I was reading was that it's not just the doctor seeing, you know, whether or not you have a penis or vagina. It actually, on the chromosomal level, some people do not have clear male or female chromosomes. Some people have an interesting mix of both. Or so I mean, even at even at that scientific level, it's hard to determine.
I just don't buy that argument that you're born this way and that's who you are, because we're leaving out actual human beings who are not born quote unquote this way or that way. And, you know, therefore, yeah, the argument kind of goes out the window then.
And again, we're talking about sex here, not gender, you know, so we're talking about male or female right now. And then if that weren't enough, they take the extra step of then saying male equals man, female equals woman. And that is not how every culture has done it, you know, throughout history. And that is not necessarily the only way to do it. You know, there's a billion factors that create your gender identity over your entire lifetime. It starts from the moment or probably before you're born, things that you hear, things that you sense, you know, the first things that you identify with when you are born. I mean, and so for people that attempt to convert people away from how they feel they are, you are messing with a billion factors, probably a trillion factors that this person has, you know, taken in throughout their lifetime, and in their own special, unique way, whatever way you think that is, whether it's a soul or whether it's biology or whatever, nature or nurture or both. You know, you're fighting against something that is much more complex than you're thinking it is.
Yeah, well said.
And so, we talked about how traditionally your sex is assigned at birth, and if that doesn't get it correct, we look at the different, I guess you could say, different versions of trans people. And throughout history, you have transgender, transsexual, which is not used nowadays, and then there's transvestite, which is a term that is
really
also
used.
Very so not used, and that in today's standards is someone who is a cross-dresser, you know, someone who's in drag.
That was in the 80s, that in the 70s, especially with like Rocky Horror Picture Show. I don't know if you guys remember that.
Yeah,
was like,
Sweet Transvestite is the main song from that. Yeah.
So, Curtis, could you go into those three different distinctions a little bit?
Yeah. So transvestite is important to know what the word means, because you do hear it a lot in historical text, and like we were talking about or like you said, in Rocky Horror, things like that. You know, it's okay in the historical aspect of it to say it.
Right.
You know, when I was first visiting San Francisco when I was 18 years old, you know, I was hanging out with with drag queens, and they would throw around transvestite and tranny all the time, and like sort of just, you know, kind of just reference or whatever. So I actually thought it was totally acceptable, but even then, I guess it was controversial, and even more so now. So let's start with transgender. Transgender is the word that is acceptable. It's a much bigger umbrella of a word. It does not have the negative connotation that transvestite, or even to some degree transsexual, does. It's the most commonly accepted terminology for a trans person, transgender. A transgender person is one whose gender identity does not correspond to the sex they were assigned at birth. When I first started researching this show, I was talking to my friend Storm, and one of the main reasons I was confused by trans people was I kept asking the wrong questions. The question I would ask would be something like, um, when they make their transition from a boy to a girl, and Storm would stop me and say, no, they didn't transition. They always were.
Right.
Yeah.
And so transgender is for those who want to be identified as somebody who was assigned incorrectly at birth. That's the right term to use for them. But some people, especially younger people, don't even necessarily like being known as trans at all. They just feel they're a woman, they're a man. But if you absolutely have to make the distinction, or if they have to make the distinction for, say, being on a show or something like that about the topic, they might say trans woman, trans man, or just transgender. So that's the general overall word that is really good to use. Let's skip ahead a little bit. Transsexual is more controversial. Transsexual implies more that you were something and now you are something different thanks to a sex change. You heard transsexual a lot in the 70s, 80s, and 90s on shows like Jerry Springer, things like that. It's sort of a nasty word to use because it implies that you are only as much as your surgery allows. And now a lot of the new understanding of gender is that you can be a man or a woman even if you have not transitioned physically. Some people choose to transition physically through a surgery or through hormones and things like that, but not everyone does. And if you specify transsexual, you're specifically talking about somebody who has physically transitioned, and that can be offensive to somebody who doesn't feel they need to or can't afford to and wants to, but still feels they're a woman or a man from the beginning, from birth.
Well, and with the term transsexual, you look at the history of trans people and queer people in the United States that we discussed in Queer's History, is their lifestyle, their behavior, and their identities were always so often equated to deviancy. And so having sexuality, having sex within the term itself is another way that society tried to make it synonymous with what they deemed as deviant behavior, deviant ideology.
And it brought it back, and that's totally true, and it brought it back to sex again when we're really talking about gender. That's why we're really trying to hammer home that point of the difference between sex and gender. Sex is your biology, gender is who you are in your head. And that is totally true. Every movie, every depiction of a I'll just say transgender person, in the 70s, 80s, before that, they were always the psychopath. They were always the killer. They were always the messed up one, the person on drugs, and while they do have, dealing with all this does mean that you are more likely to fall into some of those lifestyles. It's also a cliche and a really negative stereotype that a lot of transgender people have rightfully gotten away from.
And then we get into what I was saying, transvestite, which is way out of date, no longer used at all, but it's referring to cross-dressers.
And many of them were straight men.
Absolutely. We talked about it in, I think it was part 1 of Queer's History. I was referencing a scientist from the early 1900s who wrote a medical article. He was the first person to really say that cross-dressing is not synonymous with sexuality. And so cross-dressing is more specifically dealing with gender expression and gender identity, once again, separate from the actual sex of it.
Yeah, and just imagine, up until recently meeting like the 70s or even later into like the 90s, this was considered a mental illness, and a lot of people didn't feel that they were causing any harm to themselves or others. They didn't feel like this was a pathological issue, and that they basically just didn't fit their gender norm. Definitely something I wanted to talk about, since now we kind of understand how anyone could kind of fall into this misclassification of their gender and have to reform it over time and correct it. Let's talk about gender roles in society.
Which, Kara, can I ask you one, as a woman, as a millennial woman, and then also as a woman who grew up within the Mormon community, what was your view? What was your experience with gender roles growing up?
Well, let me tell you something. The fact that I'm having kids and my boyfriend and I aren't married yet, I am a colossal failure in the eyes of the Mormon Church as a woman. I will it up. My friends and I were talking about this the other day. We were talking about, like, what does feminism mean to us? And she said, feminism to me is you don't have to have traditional gender roles. And in my opinion, what I believe feminism is you get to pick what gender roles you want as a woman. And I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with wanting more traditional gender roles. Hell, my boyfriend can go to work and bring home the money all day if he wants, and I'll keep that house clean. For us. I believe that my version of feminism is women being able to determine what that looks like. And if that means you stay home and take care of the kids, that's great. If that means you're the breadwinner, that's also great. But I just want women and men to support us in being able to define what that is without having that thrust upon us.
It's funny you say that, because my wife Shelby, who was on the last episode, she always jokes about how she's like, one day I hope that I can just make enough money so that you can stay home, take care of the kids, work on your podcasts, and then just enjoy life. And I'm like, appreciate that, babe. Thank you.
There's a quote that I absolutely loved, and I'm going to paraphrase it. It's from TransGender History by Susan Stryker. Again, a lot of this is what we're getting this from. I just absolutely love it. And I don't even consider myself a feminine person. I'm definitely not a woman, but I loved this line. So this is how it went. It went, sometimes womanhood is a binding in place that needs to be resisted and worked against, and sometimes women want womanhood to stick to them like a wet silk dress.
Oh, I love that.
Right?
I feel like that's exactly what my friend and I were talking about the other day. And their empowerment in being able to, I believe in being able to really thrive in your femininity. Like, that can be empowering for a lot of women, and that's okay. But sometimes that's not what people want, and we got to support that too.
And it changes over your life. It changes in the moment. I mean, sometimes you want to feel a certain way. Sometimes you don't. And you definitely don't want to be told what moment you should be that and when you shouldn't be.
Oh, that's a fantastic quote. I love that.
That was like my favorite quote from the entire book. I mean, it was that I listened. I think I rewound that like 4 or 5 times, just like say it again, because I was listening to on audio.
So much of this boils down to, we're talking about feminism, talking about gender identity and expression, and so much of it boils down to, if it's not hurting somebody, if it's not outright just hate, if it's not, really just like going against, infringing on somebody else's rights and somebody else's way of living, just be happy. Like, why do you have to let it bother you if someone's trying to be who they are, even though it goes against your norms?
Shout out to my libertarian friends out there. Less laws, less people telling you what you should do.
Oh, I do enjoy libertarians. I have one of my old coworkers and friends, John Zener. He is a great libertarian. I love hearing his opinions and thoughts on things, because it's pretty fascinating point of view.
So there's a lot. I agree. So there's a lot of science that basically tells us, the theory is that it's a gender schema, which is an organized set of gender-related beliefs that influence your behavior. So when you're 3 or 4, you start identifying as either male or female. You start, as a man or a woman or a boy or girl. You start, even the toys you're playing with, you might identify with one over the other. You might, in school, you might start you can hear the same thing as another person, but you can retain only the parts that are related to your identified gender.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the arguments that a lot of people give for, for always feeling that they were assigned the wrong gender at birth was the way that they think at the fundamental level is either as, a man or a woman. And even when they were kids, it was as a boy or a girl, no matter what they were assigned. And so there's actually a lot of studies that have found that people who are trans, that they tend to actually think at the most fundamental levels in their real gender, not the assigned gender they've been given.
My high school German teacher, she always told me, once you can just continually think in whatever language you're studying, that's when you are determined to be fluent in that language. Like, once you can just freely think. And so it kind of goes along those lines of, if that's how you think in your mind, that's how your mind works, I think there's justification to say, well, that's probably what your gender is.
Yeah, I agree. And like we talked a lot about intersex already. Again, 2% of people are born intersex, and it definitely throws kind of a whole wrench in the binary understanding. If 1% to 2% of people do not fit your understanding of gender, then that means that you probably don't understand gender all that well.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, let's get to history.
Yeah, let's get into some history. So let's start off with some major trans people within history, and that's going to start with Magnum Hirschfeld, which is an awesome name.
It is.
It's just
sounds like a condom.
The greatest name. Which
You said it.
Which, speaking of German, Magnum Hirschfeld was a German physician and sexologist based in Berlin in the late 1800s.
Yeah, they started the first gay rights group. Homosexual men and women were, quote, given voice in 1897 for the first time with the founding of the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. That's how you say it in English. I'm not going to.
You don't want to do the German one?
You want to do it?
Wissenschaftlich Humanitarisches Komitee.
Oh my goodness, that sounded so much better than what I would have done.
Wissenschaftlich is a very fun word. Anyways.
Yeah, I love hearing it. So at the time, this was 1897, they fought unsuccessfully to get the penal code deleted, which made gay sex illegal, which was at that time punishable by hanging. I believe that was probably a sodomy law. I don't think it was necessarily just being gay. I think it was the act of doing gay, as we keep saying.
Right.
But based on this, Magnum Hirschfeld became interested in gay rights when he noted that many of his psychiatric patients who were homosexual were ending their own life at a higher rate than the norm.
Even then, suicidal rates have consistently always been higher, and you wonder why.
Yeah, I mean, and thankfully, I think it's coming down for the first time lately. I mean, just by a little bit, a couple of percentage lower in trans people, but it's still much, much too high. So beginning in World War I and the Nazi seizure of power in many of the larger German cities, gay nightlife became it was tolerated at the time, and the number of gay publications increased. So during this time, we saw the first kind of big jump in homosexual people being able to be more of themselves in public. It was a little bit of a kind of a naive period in human history because the 20s in general were just this big kind of party. I mean, everyone was drinking way too much. People were being much more open than they ever had been all over the world. And then, when Hitler started taking over in the 30s, and when the Great Depression happened, there was suddenly a huge flip, and a lot of these people had to go into hiding. A lot of these people, were imprisoned, and it basically just became a terrible time to be alive if you were a queer person.
World War II kind of messed up the whole train track of equal rights for queer people basically everywhere. It took everything off the bandwagon because World War II was the hip thing at the time.
Well,
It was
and World
happening.
War II was about freedom. I
Hmm.
mean, that's why it was supposed to be such a justified war, was that we were fighting for the freedom of Jews to exist. We were fighting against, one race just deciding they were better than
Well,
everyone else.
but then ironically, you look at, and Trump actually, to tie to the current administration, Trump said he with the new TikTok sale, he wants to put in $5 billion in the deal to put towards the American education system to teach real history, to teach
Real
not
history.
false history. And I
Yeah,
wonder if that's going to
yeah.
include the fact that you said this is fighting for freedom. It's fighting to stop the genocide of 6 million Jewish people. Yet here in America, we're putting how many millions of Japanese Americans in internment camps?
Right. I
It's
mean, our history textbooks are more accurate than ever. So if he's going to teach the real history, my thinking, and he hasn't said this, but my thinking is that he wants to go back to how it used to be, where America was always the good guy. White people did nothing bad to black people or to gay people. I mean, it basically, he means his history,
Right.
mhm.
double his.
Teach
Well,
the actual history because it's not very pretty.
because even then, America didn't get in because following World War One, you go into the 20s and the Great Depression, and America was intensely isolationist. America was like, we are not getting involved with everybody. We're going to focus on ourselves. We are America. It's just us. And we, at the beginning of World War II in Europe, it we sent some aid. We were helping out a little bit financially, but we didn't get into it until we got our feet wet with Pearl Harbor, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, let's go to war. So this idea that, and although America obviously did, bring an end to the war and was the ultimate, champion of World War II and World War One, America's not this champion of freedom, this just high and mighty, like altruistic country that everyone seems to think it is. Like there's the good, the bad, and the ugly, and we can't just ignore the bad and the ugly so that we can enlighten the good.
It's confusing because sometimes we are and sometimes we're not. I
Yeah.
mean, when you're fighting a war, there's no time to be prejudiced. You basically, I mean, every war saw the inclusion of, of people that had normally been kind of pushed aside, and suddenly they were needed. So suddenly they were included.
Mm-hmm.
Women, black people, they all had major strides during the war because there was no time for these crappy prejudice thoughts. We had to win a war. We were talking about the extinction of half the world. So during war, it was convenient to not be too picky about whether or not the person that was serving next to you was gay or not. But then as soon as the war was over
Yup.
and people had they had no problem going back to the way it used to be, and a lot of times the people that had fought just as hard with them was like, wait a minute, don't I have my rights? Can I be myself?
Right.
And no, that was the answer. You can't beat yourself. In
Mm-hmm.
1949, there was. This is a really important aspect of history for queer people. In 1949, there was a law in California by the Attorney General Pat Brown. They made a legal opinion that set trans people back for decades. That was against trans surgery. We talked a little bit about how Jorgensen, I can't remember their first name,
Mm-hmm.
but Jorgensen was a big celebrity
I
in
think it
America for
was
getting a sex
Christine
change.
Jorgensen.
You're
Yeah.
right, Christine. Yeah, Christine Jorgensen. That was a big deal, and suddenly there were people inundating doctors with wanting sex change operations, and this law was meant to stop that. It was meant to make doctors criminally liable if they tried to help people with what they saw was as an unnecessary procedure,
I
and it set everyone back decades.
I do wonder. We look at, for example, a good I guess movie reference of a historical sample is like Cider House Rules, where you had these orphanages and you had these backdoor doctors that would um, do abortions for women because abortions, were illegal, and so they would do these incredibly, or I guess not all of them, but I mean, if you're not in a hospital, it's probably going to be unsafe.
Yeah,
But
they were pretty
I
dangerous.
wonder what accounts in history there are of doctors doing backdoor gender affirmation surgeries. I don't know if there's got to be a case of it.
No, there is. There's several. The book talked about in more general terms of people who had it happen, who had it done anyway. Like you said, kind of backdoor operations. But it is really hard this far away from that time to really know for sure. There's a lot of people who were suspected of probably being trans, but it's really hard to prove. I mean, they're skeletons at this point, and you'd have to dig them up. I mean, it's too far away to figure it out. Let's see. So Virginia Prince was a famous person.
Let's skip Virginia Prince real quick, just so we can manage time, and let's go. Let's go to Harry Benjamin.
Okay. Harry Benjamin was the person that did the sex operation with Christine Jorgensen. Gained crazy acclaim for that. Had people knocking down his door to also have sex change operations. And I am using an old term as well. Sex change is the old term to use. Just because a lot of the things we're quoting used it.
Well, it goes along the idea that it's not changing. You've always been.
It's reaffirming.
Exactly. It's now it's known as gender affirmation.
Yes. And so Harry Benjamin argued that transsexuals were a group distinct from transvestites, which were heterosexual men who liked dressing in women's clothing, and were also distinct from homosexuals. Benjamin instead advocated that transsexuals be given hormones for the sex they wish to become in an attempt to fit the body with the mind. So again, Christine Jorgensen wasn't the first person in America to get this, but Christine, she was the first person to get hormone treatment in addition to the surgery.
Well, and Harry Benjamin founded, and I can't. It's he founded Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, which is now known as the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. But he created basically standards of care for transgender people at the time,
which is super important because if you don't know, a lot of the patient's diagnosis, upwards of 80% sometimes, comes from the communication with their doctor and a patient. And the efficacy of your treatment, the ability to stick to it, getting the correct diagnosis depends on that communication, and making sure that patients, regardless of their gender or how they identify, feel safe and comfortable with the doctor and are getting that correct care. It's extremely important to receive accurate diagnoses. And
absolutely. And, I mean, even if you're against abortion, I always say, don't get one, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you should stop somebody else from getting a safe surgery, because they're gonna go out and feel compelled to do it on their own in a much less safe way anyway. You want them talking to their doctor about it.
Yes. And that is, by the way, a doctor's oath that they take, is to treat patients fairly and if you can't do that, then maybe not the greatest field for you.
I agree.
It's kind of the same argument for people who say that sex work should be made legal in America, because, I mean, prostitution is the oldest occupation in the world. It's been around forever. And, the argument is, well, if prostitution's going to be there, let's make it legal so that they can, have healthcare, they can have, proper care, they can have insurance, they can have all this stuff to make it actually safe, rather than you have people taking part in these dangerous practices.
Well, and most of the problem that people have with prostitution is the pimp, basically the the aspect of it that becomes the the dangerous part. It's the person standing on the street corner thing is not necessarily the greatest, but at the same time, the actual act of having sex for money is not necessarily a terrible thing if they're doing it for themselves and not being forced into, slave labor, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so let's move on to Reed Erickson. Reed Erickson is probably my favorite historical trans figure that I read about.
Very, like, Reed Erickson kind of had their hands in a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, basically, so okay, let's start at the beginning. Reed Erickson was a trans man millionaire. At the time of his death, he was supposed to have had, I think it was $40 million in the bank. And this again was in the 60s. So absolutely rich. In 1964, he launched the Erickson Educational Foundation, a nonprofit oh my goodness, what's that word?
Philanthropic.
Philanthropic. Thank you. Organization funded and controlled entirely by him. And so Erickson actually worked with Harry Benjamin, who we were just talking about, to get their surgery to better identify as a man, and in exchange actually funded much of Harry Benjamin's work, including helping Harry Benjamin publish his book that he ended up publishing.
The Transsexual Phenomenon.
Thank you. Yeah, the Transsexual Phenomenon, which was one of the first fairly accurate portrayals of trans people in literature. Did not demonize them. In addition to, also the philanthropy that Reed Erickson did not just end there. They actually started different outreach programs to help people understand what they were going through, to give them tips on things like how to get IDs that had the correct name that they identified with, to help them talk to people like Harry Benjamin that could help them if they were indeed to the level of needing that help. And so they actually had an office that you could contact, and the office would give you kind of a pre-screener to figure out, it's like, are you really serious? Are you really, is this something that you just kind of thought of today, or is this something that you feel is truly a deep part of your soul? And if it was, they would pass you along to people that could help you, including with things like hormones, which would cut some of the pain that you were feeling emotionally because you did not identify with the body that you were in.
Well, and y'all will hear it in our first interview coming up with our guest Holly, where she talks about, it's an emotional pain, but it's literally physical, and it's something that someone who's not going through that could never understand. But I think there's so much more pain associated with it that there's just no way of truly grasping unless you're going through it.
And then Erickson started greasing the wheels, as they put it in the book that I was reading, with different universities, and actually got universities on board to start doing safer sex surgeries, and made it a more I don't know how to put it, like a higher education goal. Mm-hmm. They felt they were treating the people, not necessarily just helping them, but and some people criticized that they were studying them, like, almost like lab mice or something. So there is some criticism of it, but what it did, though, is it actually did give the trans people a lot more options that they could access, and somebody to look up to, probably, because I mean, my goodness, trans person millionaire is nothing, not too shabby.
Mm-hmm. Most notably, too, one of the schools, Johns Hopkins, was one of the ones that Erickson was able to help fund and create.
They actually were the first that became established, the first med school, and then others followed. In the early 60s, Johns Hopkins was in the forefront of gender identity science, and it's built. Baltimore Hospital was the site of the nation's first gender affirmation surgery. in 1966. So meaning the first one that happened, I believe, on the soil in America versus an American. The hospitals continued actually with that study, but it actually has become somewhat controversial and over time because they're actually trying to now build a program that studies the trans phenomena, but a lot of people, even people who are alumni, have signed a petition to try to stop it, and the hospital basically says we're not going to stop. We're really committed to our queer community. So so even today, this is something I thought was interesting. So at the time, this was considered a disorder that they were trying to help. It was called GID, gender identity disorder. It fell along the lines of a pathological illness, and that was sort of the framing for why doctors could help is that they could help alleviate it. But the double standard was also that that even though it was considered an illness, you actually couldn't get your insurance companies up until even now, but especially up until like not that long ago, you couldn't get your insurance companies to actually help pay for it because they said it was elective. So you were forced to say you were ill, but you were also not able to get the help you needed, even if you were ill. So it was this really weird double standard. Even in the American, the ASA, I believe it's called, or ADA, excuse me, the American Disabilities Act. Even that in the 1990s actually specifically excluded trans people from getting from getting a disabled status, even though they were often considered to be somehow ill.
Think of that. You're a young trans person in the the early 60s, and you are told you are ill, you are sick, you are not correct in the head, but we're not gonna help you. What kind of a country is that? Like the standards are wild.
It really is. In the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson was trying to fight poverty. He called it the war on poverty. And so they were allocating money to different cities to help out neighborhoods that were disadvantaged. And San Francisco became one of the epicenters of trans people because people there fought to get the trans people help as a disadvantaged group. And it was the first time that the argument had been used that you could be disadvantaged for something other than your race, or I believe gender was also somewhere in there, but it was the first time, especially usually race was thought to be kind of the most disadvantaged you could be. And then now here was a type of person that could be included in that as well. And so they actually allocated money into the Tenderloin district, which had a lot of sex workers. Many of them were trans, and many of them were homeless. And they attempted to help them. And it actually gets back right to what we were talking about in the previous episode with the Compton riot, that was mostly done by trans women.
Yeah, the cafeteria riot, right?
Yeah, it was a cafeteria that they would often hang out in, and the police were called to remove them, and they threw a cup of coffee in the policeman's face, started a little riot. People smashed the windows, became a big thing. And again, because this was the only place that a lot of these people had to hang out because they were thrown out of every other aspect of society.
We saw it in in San Francisco, and then we saw it at Stonewall, where there was this incredibly toxic discourse between police and trans people, and this funding ultimately brought in, and they were able to build an office that was basically a means of communicating between the two bodies, and they brought in a police liaison, Elliot Blackstone, who sounds like an awesome person. But I want to ask you, before we talk more about Elliot, did you, within your research, see anything? Did Elliot have any interactions with Harvey Milk?
They didn't bring that up. I believe I believe Elliot Blackstone's time was mostly in the 60s. I believe that Harvey Milk's claim to fame time was mostly in the 70s.
Was it in the
So
okay, I couldn't remember.
But I mean, it stands to reason that they would have known each other. But
it's fair to think. But anyways,
but no, I didn't hear anything specifically. But yeah, do you want to talk about Elliot Blackstone?
No, you can go ahead. That's fine.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so Elliot Blackstone was a really cool part of history that honestly doesn't have a lot. There's not a lot written about him. I heard about it in that book that I keep referencing, Transgender History. But it's really important. Elliot Blackstone was a policeman that was hired to basically be the liaison between police and the queer community because there was so much tension going on after the Compton riot. So, so a riot did a really good thing. It actually stopped, gay people and queer people from being just arbitrarily beaten up and called names and jailed for being who they were, because in San Francisco, at least at this time, a lot of the laws about cross-dressing were actually being repealed, and yet the police were still arresting people for these laws that were no longer even on the books.
Curtis, you just said, Arise did a really good thing. That's pretty timely, I think. But we've seen it through history is you push people and you push people and you take away their rights, and eventually they're going to say enough, like enough is enough, and they're going to fight back. And that doesn't mean that they're disorderly and trying to wreak havoc. Once you shove someone down enough, and once you take away enough of their rights and tell them that who they are is a mistake, they're going to get fed up with it. So, I think that's a great point to make, because riots aren't just people who are angry and want to throw things through windows. There are people who have been pushed around and oppressed for so long that they don't have any other choice. They're saying, you're going to listen to me.
Well, and that's why it was so disappointing, Trump's reaction to Black Lives Matter. It was his reaction and people like him that caused the riots. It's because, they tried to do it peacefully, and that was complained about, so they did it more, violent, meaning like at least burning down buildings and stuff like that. And that's not right either. But at the same time, you left them no other option. And instead of learning from those mistakes, Trump doubles down on it again, and backs up police officers that are doing the exact wrong thing in these situations, and again fans the flames, versus what they did here, with having a liaison between a police representative that actually had some empathy for the people he was talking to rather than just disdain, and solve so many problems rather than making it worse.
And the people that are serving, like the police officers and our politicians, they're serving the public. And so this was such a great example of that. How can we serve this community better? How can we better protect you? And that's why I love this story. This example in this human.
Well, he said, stop arresting them for using the wrong toilets. I mean that was, it was, even back then it was actually illegal, but it was so dumb. It's like, stop putting people in jail for something so dumb.
Well, you look at oppressive laws are just they're so dumb. It's you look at Rosa Parks getting arrested for sitting in the front of the bus. That's so dumb. It's a bus. Who cares? You look at the sit-ins that from black college students and some white college students in the early 60s, and they weren't allowed to sit at the bar and the diners. They were pushed to sit in the back in the far corner. And, obviously these crazy riots and whatnot broke out, and it led to the, it's called the CCC. It's basically the coalition of young college students that fought against racial injustice at the time. And they're just these dumb laws where it's like, why does it matter? But it's that's what suppression is. That's what superiority does. It does these little things that takes away so much.
Well, and it's so infuriating talking to somebody about this, because this should not be it should not be a political thing. I mean, this should not be like, you're Republican, therefore you're against the riots. Like, this should be, you're Republican, okay, you love your low taxes, okay, great, but you also don't think that shooting a black person in the back is ever okay. Like, let's start with that.
It is quite interesting because you look at the core of Democrat and Republican, and the core of it is big government, small government. Taxes, lower taxes, or no taxes. But there are these stigmas.
But more police.
Right. Like, there are these stigmas that have been built in and just taken on by so many people that identify with these different political ideologies. And it's like, but why does this have to be a part of that? Why does it have to be associated with that? This is not a political issue, it's a human rights issue, right? How many times have we heard that nowadays?
Exactly. And it's true. I mean, it really is. The other thing that Elliot Blackstone did, what I don't have in the notes here, but he actually started a church group that was accepting of trans people. And it was one of the reasons that that some of the churches in San Francisco have been accepting of queer communities since the 70s and ever since, basically. When we get to talking more about religion and things like that, or as we did in the last episode, that's how you start merging it. You bring somebody who can talk about both sides and bring people together versus splitting them apart. Okay, let's move on. So 1967, transgender people in San Francisco formed COG, Conversion Our Goal, which was the first known transsexual support group in the United States. However, within a year, the organization had disintegrated into two competing groups, neither of which existed very long, but it is important that they existed at all. The more successful one, though, was the National Transsexual Counseling Unit, which was funded by Reed Erickson, which we've talked about a few minutes ago.
Fingers and everything.
Well, and the cool thing that they did was they gave people for the first time a very simple, basic orange ID card that matched their social gender. Because the problem was, a lot of times if you were trans, you could not get help because you didn't have the proper ID. And so this actually gave people identity. So if they got pulled over by a cop, they could give them this, and the card. It actually said something pretty controversial. I don't think I have it written down here, but it said something along the lines of this person is being treated for transsexualism or something like that, which basically meant, like, to the cop, it meant, okay, this person is getting help. But what it really meant was this person is getting support.
Right.
And that was huge for that time. Nobody else had thought to treat these people in that way. Let's see. And then, let's move on. So yeah, I think I wrote a note here about the 1970s in case you weren't there, because none of us were.
No, we were not.
The 1970s were basically, there's a big thing of gender bending in your hairstyle and your clothing. So it actually became a lot more acceptable for people not to be so rigid into their biological sex or into the gender that people thought they were.
Well, we look at pop culture at the time. Glam rock was exploding, and you had people like David Bowie and Ziggy Stardust, which was just a leading example in the world of gender expression, of someone who can come in with this kind of ambiguous identity as Ziggy Stardust, and people could look at that as an idol, someone with actual clout is doing this in the world, someone who's the most famous rock star ever. Like, I could do that.
There's definitely a privilege too that comes with having money and protection, because I think that type of gender expression is not, like, if you're in rural America, in a small town,
not possible.
Have that luxury. So
yeah.
I do think that these celebrities and these people showed that it's okay to do that, but I do want to remember too that they definitely are a lot more protected than some people.
Yeah, and then also for context too, I think it's really important to talk about feminism in this episode, because there's a debate that goes on today of whether or not trans women should be accepted in feminism groups, and this all started from the 1973 meeting that basically chaos just broke out. So Betty Freeman, they did something called the feminism mystique, began the second wave of feminism. And their organization was a national organization of women, with NOW now, was established based on some of these ideas. While the feminist mainstream was white, well-to-do, there were lots of people that kind of questioned whether or not it was okay to be identified only by those people, and there was a lot of additional questions that were added of whether or not they should add trans women, whether or not they should add Black people, basically non-white people, exactly how progressive they were going to be. In 1970, so self-named radical feminists made their voice heard in the Second Congress of Women in 1970 when they spoke against Betty Freeman, which had limited the inclusiveness of lesbians because she feared that they would, quote, lessen the feminist appeal to the overall population and hamper its progress. I think that's wrong, but I also think that probably was true. That's something I've heard trans people say today, is that they don't feel included in the queer movement because they feel that basically gays and lesbians got the right to marry and they kind of just left them in the dust.
Right. It's
because they wouldn't be accepted.
I feel like it was kind of a thing where within the queer movement, it was kind of like, okay, we got this, like, let's sit down for a minute because we've made it this far, but there's still so much that's left behind.
Yeah, I mean, they even called him the Lavender Menace, which I thought was funny because, we were talking earlier about the lavender scare, and so for some reason lavender is just the queer color, I guess. I had no idea.
It's a nice color. I like it.
They called him the Lavender Menace. They turned off the mics and stormed the stage. They passed out readings of this pamphlet that was titled "Women Identified Women," which started off with the phrase, quote, "A lesbian is the rage of all women condensed to the point of explosion."
Oh boy.
And so basically they stormed this very kind of hoity-toity meeting and said, no, we're going to be included too. And they basically demanded it. And a lot of what they were talking about was they tried to link queer women to overall women through the shared understanding of gender oppression. And what's interesting is this, before I even understood what a lesbian was, I understood of this idea of this typical heterosexual relationship where one person is feminine, one person's masculine. And when people are brand new at this and they're trying to understand how two women can be together, a lot of times they very rudely ask, kind of like, who's the man, who's the butch, who's the femme, right? It's kind of like the way that people try to understand it when they don't really understand that doesn't necessarily have to be the way a couple is.
There was an episode of Queer Eye, the new Queer Eye, and I think it's like one of the first episodes, and it's just this old white man and middle of Georgia or whatever, and just a super friendly guy, just doesn't have knowledge of the queer community. And so at one point he and the Fab Five are driving somewhere and they're just like talking in the car, and he asks Jonathan Van Ness, or one of them anyways, I can't remember who it was, well, which one's the man and which one's the woman? And it's the same as this. Well, who, butch and femme, it's like, well, who wears the pants in the relationship? And it's like, well, it doesn't work exactly like that.
But also, like, that question implies, again, back to those like very stereotypical gender roles, like, well, who's the man and woman in your relationship? Like, we don't ask like straight that. Like, it really just hammers home that you have to follow some type of gender stereotype. And so God, that's such an annoying question.
Well, it's funny because Shelby and I are the exact opposite of gender norms. Like, she's the breadwinner, she works, I'm currently unemployed, I'm the one who cooks dinner every night, I'm the one who cleans the house. Even when I had a job, I still did all that. And it kind of comes down to, it's like, who cares? Just live your life. Like,
I mean, whatever works is I mean, that's how I always say, you can find somebody that's perfect for you, that is the yin to your yang, like what does it matter, that they're fitting some stupid stereotype?
Yeah, but also gender roles, whatever you want to call them, also change with times to fit what's convenient. Just like when all the guys went off to war, women started working in workshops and warehouses to change with the times. So surely the same thing can be said about your personal relationships that happen under your
Yeah.
roof. Like,
Well,
really, you should your gender roles to what works for your family.
yeah, I mean, it changed again in the 70s when all of a sudden, thanks to staggering or not staggering, stagnating wages, suddenly both people in a couple had to work, and the cliche of a woman staying home, all absolutely staying home and not ever having to go out, became very inconvenient because a lot of times we're talking about stereotypical couples here. A lot of times the breadwinner, which was the man or whatever, he couldn't afford to pay for everything. and guess what? Women wanted to make money too. So, I mean, in a way it worked out, but
So if America can change gender stereotypes when it fits the narrative, then you can go ahead and do whatever you want to do in your own house.
Okay, so let's skip to 1973, the Lesbians Feminist Conference. Beth Elliott was a trans, or I don't think she's alive anymore. Let's say is just in case. Beth Elliott is a trans woman who was involved in the women's movement and helped create the West Coast Lesbian Conference. However, everyone at the time did not know that they were trans. She was trans. And so she was supposed to be giving a performance that a lot of cis-lesbians thought she shouldn't give because she wasn't a, quote, real woman. So, this kind of shows the divide right away when queer people started getting notoriety, started getting power, that there was a lot of prejudice among other queer people.
Well, this ideology of trans women not being able to be included within feminism is still going on today with people like J.K. Rowling.
That's what
Absolutely. And the argument that this book makes, and a lot of the articles actually makes, was that the arguments of J.K. Rowling and a lot of people who are anti-trans being included in women's spaces are exactly from this time period and from even a speech that was given, I believe it's at the same conference over this very issue. 1,300 people were there. It was the largest meeting of lesbian people up to that time. And a lot of people report having seen this and actually it affecting their future opinions decades later. So I mean, this was a speech that basically got heard around the world and got translated into various books and various opinions later on. Let's see. So Elliot did give a brief performance, but then ended up leaving the conference. The following day, Robin Morgan gave her address, which she had altered based on the events that had happened, meaning a trans person was discovered to be at the at the lesbian meeting, and she titled this speech "Lesbian and Feminism: Synonyms or Contradictions."
Yeah,
that one always gets me angry for some reason.
That's pretty intense wording right there.
She called them gate crashing. She called them male transvestites. She called them an opportunist, an infiltrator, and a destroyer, and even compared them to a rapist.
That's some pretty intense propaganda.
It was.
A very angry person like that. That's a lot of anger to be coming from that.
And I believe it actually is a lot of the reason that when things like the bathroom debate comes up, when you constantly hear this thing, well, what if they're a rapist? What if they're in there to rape women? What if what if a man could just say he's a woman and go in at any time? And all these arguments, I believe, actually come from the misunderstanding of her speech, because she was actually saying that the idea, not the literal person, the idea of a trans person was raping the idea of what it meant to be a woman.
And it all comes down to the original idea that queer people were equated to deviancy. That's what it's always been, and it's always deviant behavior.
When it's almost always the opposite. It's almost always the trans person that is murdered, or or the act of violence is against the trans person. It is almost never the other way around.
It's very, in my opinion, and I'm saying this as a woman who has dealt with all the shit that comes with being a woman, I feel like it's really misdirected anger. Like, you're mad, you're saying that this person simply just can't understand the difficulties of being quote unquote a woman, but that anger is misdirected. Like, that's not where the anger is. That's not with somebody, who is a woman, and who was just born into the wrong body. Like, be angry at the society that makes it so difficult to be a woman.
Be angry at the patriarchy.
Yeah, like, you're mad at the wrong person, in my opinion.
Well, and just because somebody else gets rights does not mean your rights go away. You lift up yourself when you lift up other people. Like, that is true with the Black Lives Movement. You don't have to say all lives matter. That's implied. Black Lives Matter means all lives matter.
But the people the people who say all lives matter, and obviously this is incredibly subjective, but the people who say all lives matter see the term or the phrase Black Lives Matter as saying Black lives are more special. Black lives mean more. When in reality, and it goes with so many different, you say trans lives matter, you say, gay lives, lesbian lives matter. It's the fact that these lives have been oppressed and shut down for how many years. You have two hands. You have your right hand, your left hand. You break your left hand. Both of your hands still matter, but it's safe to say, hey, my left hand matters, meaning let's take care of this one. It's been hurt. It's been ignored. Therefore, let's bring it back so that it's equal, so that it matters just as much as the right hand. And that's what all of this is trying to say.
That's really interesting. I've never heard that.
That is such a good analogy, and I wish we could make people understand that more. But Curtis, when you were researching some of this too, from my understanding, the biggest, especially the J.K. Rowling thing and stuff like that, the argument is that you chose to be a woman, and therefore it's not fair because you don't know what it's like to actually have to be forced to go through what a woman goes through. That's the argument, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I understand how that comes from, again, a place of anger and hurt and frustration, because it does suck to be a woman sometimes. But again, you're mad at the wrong person.
The way that some people put it is that this is the ultimate example of male patriarchy, that they can even pretend to be a woman, is how they put it. And they can even take over feminism as a man, and that's not their place and all this stuff. And they really feel attacked. They feel personally attacked by the presence. And it's crazy because I myself, and I'm not a woman, so maybe that's why, but I myself do not get that connection at all. It seems like completely separate issues to me. Janice Raymond wrote this pretty controversial and pretty terrible book, the Transsexual Empire, the Making of the She-Male, which is a terrible.
My God!
Never use the term she-male, by the way. It's so nasty.
I totally even forgot about that term until you just said it. Wow.
Yeah, I feel bad for even bringing it up. But that's what the book was called. It was written in 1979, and they said all transsexuals rape women's bodies by reducing the real female form to an artifact and appropriating it for themselves. I'm going to skip down to the bottom because they also compare the surgery that people go through to affirm their gender as similar to what Nazis did to confirm their own superiority. Basically, that they were harming people is essentially the argument.
No, okay. The Nazis, no. Like Joseph Mengele, they cut the hands off of one twin to tell if the other twin could feel it. That is what the Nazis... Yeah. The Nazis were... Yeah. No.
It was done to inflict pain versus done to correct something, make somebody's life better.
It's not
completely different.
It's not malicious intent.
Thank you.
like it. Oh boy, that's frustrating. Oh boy.
Radical feminists reject the notion of the female brain. They believe that if women think and act differently from men, it's because society forces them to, requiring them to be sexually attractive, nurturing, deferential. So they're confusing, gender expression with gender identity here. That's why it's really important to break those two things down, because
Right.
like we were saying before, you can be a man and you're the primary cook. That's certainly my dad. He's super macho, but he is the cook of the family. He's always been the cook. My mom does not like to cook. I mean, that's a perfect example. Has
Yeah.
nothing to do with whether or not they're man or woman. It's they like to cook. And so
that is
really
why
confusing
it's
those things.
so important to break down the difference between expression, identity, and sexuality.
Absolutely. Janice Raymond updated the book in 1994 with very little change. So even though decades had went by, not much had changed in that. A lot of people like J.K. Rowling, who think like J.K. Rowling, would quote these people directly as if this happened yesterday, even though it happened like 40 years ago. So this thinking is way old. It's way outdated. It's very offensive. And I mean, I guess, they can have their opinion on it, but I don't get it. I don't know why they wouldn't want to include.
I honest to God understand where it came from, that feeling. But again, I'm going to say it a million times. It comes from a place of angry and misdirecting it. Because I understand how you're saying, well, how do you know how I felt? You got to quote unquote choose to be a woman. But the problem with that is that it also implies that the struggle of a woman is one story. Trans women also struggle of being a female. Like the female struggle does not look the same everywhere. And that to me is like the very anti-feminist to say, well, you don't fit the female struggles I had. Like, why can't we all have struggles?
Well, and the crazy thing is trans men are actually included in a lot of these meanings, meaning that they were assigned female at birth. And so they're included and they feel like that's progressive enough.
I'd be interested to hear what, maybe, have you guys seen anything about Caitlyn Jenner speaking on feminism?
I haven't, no.
I haven't really heard from her in a minute.
Yeah, I don't think anybody really has. Why don't we go into, you've got it written down here as another, or two sects of feminism that started in the third wave of feminism, which is sex positive and sex negative. What exactly, what does that mean?
It goes right into what you were talking about with whether or not prostitution is pro-feminist or anti-feminist.
Right.
Some people think it's empowering and actually is feminist, and some people think it's not. And usually the people that think it's not also tend to demonize the people who are forced to do it. Meaning forced, meaning like they are, they're making their living from it. Actually, they tend to look down on them.
It's like a perfect modern example of that is OnlyFans.
Oh yeah,
that's like it's a perfect example of you have girls who are selling pictures of their bodies and they're being sexualized and objectified and all this, and then you have it's like, well, no, they're empowering themselves by taking control of showing their bodies and charging money. So it's the same thing, sex positive, sex negative, and inside social media.
Also, I'm sorry, but there are clearly consumers of pornography and sex. There are especially a lot of these people that talk about how gross it is when women participate in sex work. Like, you consume porn? And like, why would that be for free then when you go on whatever? I just find it
they're only angry that the women are making money on their own.
Pissed about it. They're like, way around the system. Like, that's exactly what it is. It's like, you're not mad it exists because you probably consume it. You're mad they're actually making money off of it.
So sex positive basically is part of the newer waves of feminism, especially third wave, and continues on to what might be, we're already in a fourth wave apparently, but there's some conflicting views on that. Sex positive means that you are taught that taking control of sexuality is good, and that you've resisted the idea that some sexual practices were instinctively anti-feminist, like prostitution, or that criticizing some aspects of those practices unnecessarily condemn the women who practice them. I remember when Craigslist actually decided to stop offering their personal ads. It was meant to stop sex trafficking, in particular for underage people. But what they did, though, was, in addition to the good part of that aspect of it, they also did a very negative thing in that they threw people who were dependent on that work off of that website and back on the streets. So people were making good money doing it, and maybe they went to OnlyFans. I don't know. Maybe that was actually the next step. But they demonize these people without really knowing them, and they push them into, a situation where now they're really going to have to possibly put themselves in danger to do the same thing that they were already doing.
Yeah, like they're not going to stop doing it because you think, like, people are going to enjoy sex. They're going to sometimes charge for sex. They're going to sometimes like make a living doing that. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. It's not going to stop. So why don't we just find a way to make sure that when it does happen, we keep these men and women safe?
I agree.
It's not going to stop happening. So might as well be safe, just like they did in the red light district in Amsterdam. The women there, and granted, there's a small percentage of women who might not want to be there, and that's important that we continue those conversations about that. However, the women that do work freely in the red light district have access to testing. They're required to test. There are certain standards that their spaces have to be kept in, and it's resulted in a lot of positives in these women being safe.
And
I was just about to make another West Wing reference, but as I told you guys, I finished the series, and I'm not going to make any more West Wing references.
Let's just do an episode, Dalen. Let's just do a whole episode on West Wing. Let's do it.
I've got to get it all out eventually. Anyway, Curtis, go ahead with what you're going to say.
So sex negative can be summed up in one word: fetish. So people who are sex negative, meaning they equate sex with being a negative thing that is being put out there. They think that being transgender or having a genital modification surgery is a fetish that men just want to feel like a woman, but they can't quite really do it. They can't really understand it. And so that's generally, that's the two main splits between feminists, even to this day.
You know what I actually just thought about? You look at serial killers in American history and how many of them, so many of them had just intense mental issues, and so many of those mental issues were caused by them not being able to cope and deal with their gender and their sexuality in a proper way. And the effect that the history of that history within the serial killer timeline of sexually driven acts and whatnot, what that did for the queer community is just devastating.
Well, yeah, a lot of serial killers literally just hated women. Like, they hated women. They hated gay people. They hated trans individuals because they were maybe rejected by them, or they were scared of them because they didn't understand them.
Or they were them.
Exactly. They couldn't come to terms with that. But, they just hated these people. And it's really, really disturbing.
And
Well, and being queer and I'm going to speak for trans people in this case, even though I'm not a trans person, but I'm going to take the bridge for this. And being trans is an act of self-love. It's an act of goodness and of understanding and of being yourself, whereas a lot of the depiction of queer people and trans people in particular is acting as if they hate themselves. And so even though we're talking a lot about negative things that have happened throughout history, the trans people that I know are the happiest people, being themselves. The only thing that gets them down is when people deny them that.
Yeah. And you'll, for the audience, y'all will hear that very specifically when we talk with Holly in our next episode.
Absolutely. So let's just blaze through this next part really quick. I know we're kind of getting short on time. So in the 1990s, the world changed quite a bit. The AIDS epidemic was wrapping up. There was a really great organization called ACT UP. That was the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, and they really helped the queer movement by popularizing the plight of the LGBTQ people. They actually popularized the phrase queer, which is an answer to something that we've been talking about a lot that I found. They made these chapters of people throughout the country that called themselves the Queer Nation. And they popularized the phrases "We're everywhere" and "We're here, we're queer, get used to it." Real kind of funny side note. I was texting back and forth with somebody about how they were doing during the pandemic, and their response. And this is somebody that is in his like late 20s. He said, I'm here, I'm queer, and I don't have much of a career. And it just made me laugh. So like that was like this person's like even younger than we are, or younger than I am, I guess. That like knew this reference and it was still using it to this day, and applying to the pandemic and all that. Oh my gosh.
It's pretty funny how certain things just carry on through generations. Like there's little things like that,
And we don't even always know where they come from. I have heard that phrase mentioned, lampooned. I think The Simpsons had it. I remember. I think there was an episode of like Home Improvement or something where somebody said it. Like I've heard that phrase all over the place throughout my childhood, and I had no idea that this was like an important move in the queer history until right now. Do you want to move on to?
Yeah, why don't we take a look at some modern prejudices that actually come within the progressive movement?
So many. So 41% of trans people said that they've attempted suicide.
Yeah.
We have, basically trans people, they've been a part of the queer movement since the very beginning. We talked about that they were at Stonewall, not just but like a major player in Stonewall. And one of the things I hear over and over again is that they're being left behind in the queer movement because of a lot of prejudice. The T got added to LGBT in the 90s to try to show them, to give them visibility.
Yeah. Some form of solidarity.
Yeah, but even to this day, you go on Grindr or something, and there's left and right people saying, if you're trans, don't talk to me. I mean, these are gay people. These are young gay people in a lot of cases. Something that's happened pretty recently is that we've struck against using this thing called the panic defense, which was a legal term. Yeah, that a lot of people got out of doing any kind of prison time for killing or raping or hurting trans people because they discovered that they were assigned male at birth, that they had genitalia that they weren't expecting, and they gave that as a reason for why they did some terrible things, and they actually got away with it.
No, it's because you're homophobic and transphobic and you committed a hate crime. Like,
exactly.
Come on.
There's a great website called transequality.org. It's a website that chronicles trans people who have been murdered or committed suicide. November 20th every year is the Trans Day of Remembrance. I know that's really important for my friend Storm to get that mentioned because every November 20th, Storm posts about this and says, remember our fallen, remember our dead. And that is crazy. I mean, we really don't remember them up until recently. We really don't think about them.
Do you know, have you, I guess both of you, have you all seen any numbers of the difference between suicide rate of trans women and trans men?
All I know is that it's significantly higher in Black trans individuals.
Okay.
That's that I'm like very confident.
Because I know just overall the suicide rate of men is like 4 times that of women, so I'd be curious to see what that is in terms of trans women and trans men.
I don't remember coming across that figure. I would think that's because it's fairly equal,
Yeah.
but as you said, I know that non-white trans people are much higher. So not, as we said before, not all cultures, you know, equate gender
Hmm.
with sex, like ours do. I know, in Montana, especially being you being from there and me spending a large part of my life there, you hear a lot about the two spirit. Do you remember the first time you guys have heard that term?
I so I don't know a lot about it, at least up until this research, but I heard about it. Um, I think when I was like a freshman in high school. My high school was very supportive of Native American history, and we actually had a local tribe leader that taught the Native American history course at our high school. And it was great, great man. But that was the first time I heard of the idea of two spirit.
I think I probably heard about it maybe 5 years ago or so,
Hmm.
for the first time. Kara, have you heard this?
I don't think I have.
A lot of times it's in the LGBTQ, then they add the two at the end.
Okay.
LGBTQ2 plus.
Yeah, it kind of feels like a sequel to LGBTQ. So it always kind of feels a little awkward when I see it written, but it's interesting that sometimes it's included, sometimes it's not. It kind of is the reason that I think a lot of people like using the word queer versus naming all the different letters. Basically, it's the Native American people got together in the 90s. They had a meeting and they wanted to express what had always been a part of their culture, but was getting kind of changed by European American
Hmm.
culture over the last couple hundred years, and essentially before the Europeans came over and colonized America. Um, Queer people were held in pretty high regard. They were thought of as kind of
Hmm.
a really interesting and special mix of the genders, and so they were actually was thought of as an additional gender choice.
Hmm. Well, I talked about it a little bit in the first episode of Queer's History, and it was in the book Redressing the American, or I think it's Redressing America by Peter Bogue, where frontiersmen really tried to racialize homosexuality and queer people, because you can't let these white Puritans be homosexual. You have to push it on to Hispanics and Native Americans. And so when they come to the West and they see Native American culture where sexuality and gender is more fluid and expressed in different ways, it was just very different than what white America was used to and what these immigrants coming from Europe had seen before. And so this indigenous ideology of gender and sexuality has been around for centuries. And they actually met in 1990 in Winnipeg. It was the third annual Native American Gay and Lesbian Gathering, and that's where they came up with this term "two spirit" to basically create this umbrella term to cross all languages to explain this indigenous ideology within Native American history and culture.
Yeah, and I mean they really wanted to solidify it within their own culture. That's what's really
Hmm.
important. It wasn't just to necessarily like educate other cultures, non-natives. It was actually to solidify the idea among the different languages within the native nation.
Right.
So I thought that, and that was something that I had completely wrong before I did the research for this, because I thought it was just there kind of like adding to LGBTQ,
Hmm.
versus no, this was around way before a lot of these ideas and understandings that we had were there, and it was the Europeans that came over and imposed these homophobic labels
Yeah.
on them under the guise of civilizing them under Christian tradition.
It was very introspective.
So yeah, I mean that's pretty much that's pretty much all I got for research. I hopefully it didn't seem like too much of a patchwork. Like I did my best to try to put it in sort of an order that made sense.
And ultimately, you said it at the top of the show, where if there's one sentence that you take away from this episode, it's that there's a difference between your physical sex and your gender identity. It's the core of this entire topic, and it's been what's been the difference between sexuality and gender and identity is they're different things, and there's so many people who think within the binary mindset that don't understand that gender is different from your sexuality.
And the misunderstanding of it causes so much prejudice and causes so much like a lot of times when people are complaining about someone, they don't even understand what they're complaining about. They think that they're talking about their sex when they're really talking about their gender. And gender is a very personal, important thing that every individual has and every individual has to express. So we have to let them. You cannot oppress this. You cannot change it.
Well, I think that'll do it for the first episode of Whose Gender Is It Anyway? If y'all have any questions, you can shoot us an email at pwbnetwork@gmail.com, because I always get the email wrong. If you want to check out our website, you can go to podcastwithoutborders.com. We are also Podcast Without Borders on Facebook and Instagram. I think I've made like one post on Instagram, so Facebook is the better route for you if you want to check out what we're going on social media. Kara, Curtis, do y'all have anything you want to plug for today's episode?
All I have to say and plug is be nice to each other, wash your hands, and wear your mask. I hope you're something today.
I really wanted to thank Susan Stryker, which was a trans person that wrote TransGender History. It was absolutely the best resource that I found discussing a lot of this, and absolutely amazing job. Please go out, read that, because there's so much that we couldn't get to today that was so interesting about this history.
But stick around. We've got 3 more episodes in the series. The next 2 episodes coming up after this will be 2 interviews that we have with 2 trans people, and we cover some topics, and we also just ask some questions that we've been dying to ask. And we already recorded those interviews, and they were incredible. The insight and just the conversation and what they were able to share with us is just really, really enlightening. Enlightening. Oh my goodness.
Enlightening.
Yes. Thank you. See, you're saving me now. They're very, very enlightening, and I think y'all will really enjoy them. So stick around for the next episodes of Whose Gender Is It Anyway? With that, we will talk to y'all later. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Social Discord, part of the Podcast Without Borders network. You can get a hold of us by sending us an email at pwbnetwork@gmail.com. You can also check out our website at podcastwithoutborders.com. Thanks for listening.